So when I was in high school, I wasn't a very hard-working student by any means. I wasn't a troublemaker, but I was an incredibly lazy person, working just the minimum so that my parents wouldn't get angry. I've always had some kind of an easiness regarding schoolwork, and never knew what it truly meant to make any effort. And so I just spent all of my classes drawing on my copybooks without many consequences. My junior year's math teacher, who was seen by everyone as uptight but very caring, was pretty upset about this, as were many of my previous teachers. He wanted me to work harder. I wasn't bad at maths. I was around 13th or 14th out of 20, I think. I'm French, but I assume this is like having a B or a B minus or something. But sometimes my grades were very low, I'll admit. During a teacher-parents meeting, though, he told my mum that I was wasting my capacity, that it was infuriating just how lazy I was. My mum then replied that she agreed with him and that she wouldn't blame him for pushing me harder and for punishing me if it was for making me work harder. And from this day on, he did exactly what she told him to do. In every single maths class, he would always question me first before anyone else. He was always sitting next to me when we were doing exercises. During the test, he was always telling me, "You can do it." It made me feel incredibly uncomfortable because at this age, no one wants that kind of attention, right? My classmates started to realize that my maths teacher was a little obsessed by me and were teasing me a lot about this too. The last class before Christmas break, the maths teachers threw a little surprise Christmas party too. It was really nice. He gave us chocolates and mock champagne, and honestly, we had a lot of fun. During the party, he poured me another glass of mock champagne, telling me that I deserved it because I was doing a lot better. And quite honestly, it was actually true. Because of all that attention, I was forced to work, so my grades were around 15 or 16, which I think is like an A- or an A maybe. And so I accepted it, but I didn't drink it entirely. I have diabetes and already had way too much chocolate. But during the next class, I was feeling just awful. In fact, I almost fainted and finished my last day of school before Christmas in the nurse's office. At that time, I wouldn't even think that it was because of the alcohol-free champagne. I honestly thought that it was due to my diabetes, that I indeed had way too much chocolate, even if it didn't actually look like my usual crisis. A few weeks later, though, my class threw some sort of a charity event or something. It was a class project, and we were pretty proud about it. In my country, we don't have proms or anything, so it was our occasion to wear pretty formal clothes and go and dance together and whatnot. And the math teacher was invited, and he was helping some of the boys tend to the bar. He served me an alcohol-free cocktail, but before I could drink it, a classmate of mine, Flora, poured some vodka in it. Even though it was forbidden to drink alcohol at the event, I was mad because with my diabetes, I couldn't actually drink alcohol, so I told her that she could just throw the cocktail out. At the time I fought with her, she did this, but now when I think about it, I wonder if she didn't choose to drink it instead. The event ended pretty badly because of the alcohol Flora had brought. Some guys were very drunk, they started breaking things, and Flora passed out because of all the alcohol that she had, and this pretty much ended the event. Flora had been admitted to the hospital because her coma was pretty severe, and we spent the next day being lectured by all the teachers of the school. Flora got expelled from the school and never went there again. I was pretty upset with her. I mean, because of her, the whole event would now be forbidden, and our project was a complete failure. We gave a very bad image to the association that we were raising funds for as well, so it was a pretty bad thing that happened. So I just sort of kind of ghosted her and never asked her if she was doing better, etc. Now I feel bad about it, but at the time I was just pretty immature. But because of that, I guess I'll just never know if she was ill because of the alcohol or because of my cocktail and maybe something in it. But a few weeks later, I failed a maths test. It had been a long time since I'd failed one too, and the maths teacher was pretty angry with me. He yelled at me in front of everyone, saying how much of a disappointment I was, that I was hopeless, that I would just end up living in a cardboard box under a bridge. But something about this was just really off. I was feeling it. He had a really weird look in his eyes, and it chilled me, and I couldn't help it in the end, and I started crying. He calmed me down a bit and said that he would just give me an hour of detention or something, during which I could copy my lesson. I was a little surprised because normally detention is for bad behavior, not for bad grades, but I was a little relieved because it was a small punishment, and that meant that my parents would never know. But I lived kind of far from my high school, and there was only one bus every night between my high school and my home at 5 p.m. And because of that, even when I finished at 4 p.m., I would never get home before 5 p.m. And so when I had a detention between 4 p.m. and 5 p.m., I could just blame it on the bus and my parents would never know. But then, when he officially gave me the detention hour, he said that he wanted to be personally present during my detention hour, and that the only possible hour was during 5 p.m. and 6 p.m. I was really nervous about this because I would have to tell my parents to come and get me at 6 p.m., and then they would know everything. As I said earlier, I definitely wasn't a troublemaker by any means, so at first I just sort of planned to go to the detention hour, but during the day, my friends and I talked a lot about it, and I was feeling more rebellious all of a sudden, because of the sensation of being supported by my friends, I suppose. So I decided not to tell my parents that I was in detention and that one of my friends would pick me up at 6 p.m. and drive me home. At 5 p.m., when heading towards the detention room, I was pretty angry, I'll admit, mumbling that it wasn't fair to be in detention because of the one and only bad grade that I had for ages. When I arrived in front of the detention room, I realized that I was the only one waiting. I then realized, too, that I would be the only student in detention, alone with the maths teacher who was a little obsessive. And it was also getting dark outside. It was during late winter, early spring, so the night was pretty early. And after some thinking, it was a very big nope from me. And when I saw him coming, I sort of panicked. I said something like, "Sorry, I have an emergency, I have to go now. I'll email the school for rescheduling my detention hour." And then I just quickly ran off. He started to yell at me that I had to obey him and go to detention, that he would call my parents. But at this moment, I just didn't care. I sprinted towards the bus stop and I caught the bus, and remember too, he was scheduled for 5 p.m. and I just went home. I was afraid that he was going to call my parents, so when I arrived, I was literally shaking, but my parents greeted me normally, so I assumed that eventually he just didn't call them. But after this, the strangest thing happened. He just never came back the next day, nor the next few weeks. And eventually I learned that he actually quit his position. And then a shrink came during an hour to ask us if we wanted to talk about the maths teacher, but as nobody knew what was going on with him, we didn't have much to say. And so the shrink left and we never heard of him again. Until just a few months ago. You see, I became a teacher. I know, kind of ironic given my laziness when I was a teen. But one day I was chatting with my coworker and I mentioned his name, talking about my weird and bizarre maths teacher and how I skipped a detention hour. And one of my oldest coworkers went very pale hearing his name. And it was because a few days after the detention hour incident, my maths teacher was arrested for having downloaded a few pedopornographic videos from the dark web and some kind of a snuff movie starring children and young teens. He was caught, charged, and convicted for what he had done. But it got me really thinking quickly. I mean, maybe this detention hour was just a detention hour, and I would have gone out of it without any problem, but I guess I'll never know, and I'll always wonder what would have happened if I had stayed there or didn't catch my bus that day. So this happened to my dad, who told me this story when I accidentally discovered a Ouija board in a closet. My dad was living in Spain, and during the 1970s, he bought a Ouija board, the one that I discovered. He told me that he He played with the Ouija board frequently, and sometimes he received no answers or just odd responses such as random numbers or decontextualized words. And one day he told me that he talked to a wise entity which responded in everything so clearly and so philosophically that it was weird. The thing is that my dad asked it, "Where are you?" And the board started to mark random numbers and letters such as like 165 2AC 8820. My dad thought that it was just another decontextualized answer, but nevertheless, and he can't explain why, he wrote the random series of numbers and letters in a paper that he left on a shelf. But the disturbing part is that after a few years, during the 80s, my dad was watching Cosmos with Carl Sagan, and he told me that in the show, Sagan explained that scientists had discovered a new galaxy that was called a sequence of numbers and letters. My dad was so impressed by this that he copied the name of the show and he looked for the paper on the shelf, and as you probably already guessed, it was that same sequence or code. My dad was obviously fascinated with this experience, and he told me that the Ouija board is not just spiritual, it may also be interdimensional. But what do you guys think? When he told me this, I must admit that I was sort of between scared and sort of curious too, and I considered aliens using the Ouija board, which was weird, but he still believes that this wise entity is up there somewhere, talking with other people. But do you guys have any similar experiences with space things and Ouija boards like this? Let me know in the comment section below if you've ever had something like this happen to you. When I was in 3rd grade, my mother and I lived with my grandparents because my mum and dad had just divorced. My mum worked in a factory and she worked long hours, so I had to take the school bus. The walk to the bus stop was kind of long. I had to walk down this path to the end and wait by myself as well. And one day, I was standing there and a man in a silver car drove slowly by me, just staring the whole time. I dismissed it as nothing in my 8-year-old mind. I mean, it wasn't anything to worry about. That was, until he had turned around and crept back by. This happened several times too, until he finally stopped on the side of the road and started to get out of his car and walk towards me. I ran like a bat out of hell back to my grandparents' house, crying hysterically to my grandma. She called the police and gave them the small amount of information that I could remember. The best part of that day was that my grandma made me cookies and milk and called me out of school. For the rest of the time that we lived there, though, my grandma would always walk me to the bus stop and wait until I was safely on that bus. They never did catch this guy, but I hope that man never took another kid, and I'm very grateful for my mother and the fact that she told me about stranger danger all the time.